This program was made possible by funding from the UCF Global Perspectives Office.
Hello and welcome to the Global Perspective Show. I'm John Bersia, Special Assistant to the President for Global Perspectives at the University of Central Florida. Our guest today is Paul Wolfowitz, former President of the World Bank and a former senior U.S. defense official. Welcome, Mr. Wolfowitz.
Good to be here.
Thank you for joining us today. We're talking about the rising powers and how those affect the United States. And I'm wondering if you could sort of in summary fashion, tell us what the main challenges and opportunities are, and then we can get into specific questions about individual countries.
Well, the opportunities are really enormous, and I know it's sometimes presented as though this is a new threat on the horizon. I remember back 20 years ago, actually, when Japan was the rising power. The fact is, I think prosperity in other countries is, on the whole, good for the United States. It's certainly good for the people of those countries, and this phenomenon of rising powers, emerging markets has allowed millions of people in these poor countries to escape poverty. But it's been to our benefit as well. The challenges are real. It does mean increased stress on resources, increased stress on the environment. The one that I'm most concerned about is that new power relationships can lead to misunderstandings that can lead in turn to the use of force in ways that could be disastrous. We saw that 100 years ago. The world seemed to be on a very good course at the beginning of the 20th century. And then, not quite out of nowhere, but World War I happened, and the rest of the century up until the fall of the Soviet Union was just terrible. And the 20th century turned out to be the bloodiest century in history. We cannot afford to repeat that.
I think a natural response when you hear the word rising power, the term rising power, is that this is something that could potentially be a problem for the United States. And you mentioned Japan. We see Russia rising, we see China rising, and we wonder, what are their ultimate intentions? Amy Chua wrote a book called Age of Empire that looked at the rise and fall of empires throughout history, and she was trying to assess where the rising powers of today might go. And she didn't see India, for example, as a threat, but with some of the others you don't know. Mm-hmm. So how do you play that game? Do you sort of hope for the best and prepare for the worst?
Well, I think I'd put China in a very different category from all the others, partly because of its size, partly because of its economic dynamism, and partly because I think China's external behavior in the future is still a bit of a question mark. They've been, I would say, on the whole, fairly responsible with some exceptions in their international behavior to date. I think one of the exceptions, frankly, and they would say it's not an international issue, but it has international implications, is the military buildup opposite Taiwan. But that's no guarantee for the future. And one thing that does worry me about China, it's a political system that lacks legitimacy, because they claim to be ruling on the basis of the communist theory of the vanguard of the proletariat, but none of them believe in that anymore. That would be like trying to govern England based on the divine right of kings. It's ridiculous. So instead they substitute the impressive legitimacy that comes from double-digit economic growth and increasing prosperity. But if that falters for some reason, unfortunately one of the alternatives might be nationalism and whipping up nationalist sentiment to rally people behind the regime. That could be dangerous. By the way, in saying that, I'm not predicting that will happen. On the whole, I would lean toward the more positive prediction, but your phrase, hope for the best and prepare for the worst, I think it's a good formula, provided preparing for the worst doesn't become a self-fulfilling prophecy. I think we have to be careful not to push China into a feeling that it's being cornered or encircled. That's not the point. But if China begins to behave aggressively, it needs to know that it confronts a coalition of countries that are prepared to stand up to it.
Yeah, it's interesting to see how the country, or a country, changes its behavior as it develops more and more economic power, military power, and political power. And I think you're right, China is a big question mark. But do you sense that it could become more aggressive as it gains more power? And does it have great power intentions that go beyond the Asia-Pacific region? Do you see it as a country that will develop military capabilities that it can project globally at some point?
I would say certainly at some point they're going to have the economic capacity to do that if they decide to. By the way, economic capacity doesn't automatically translate into these things. It's taken the U.S. literally decades of developing all the skills that go into having a global naval capability. It takes more than just building expensive ships, although you have to be able to do that. I think China's bound to have global interests, if nothing else, driven by the need for energy and resources. And we're already seeing that to some extent in the way they seem to be buying everything. I was going to say everything that moves. It's actually the things that are underground that haven't moved yet in Africa and elsewhere, the natural resources and the oil. And unfortunately, they showed a tendency in this recent confrontation with Japan to manipulate their large, it's not a monopoly, but it's a very large position in the rare earth market to say, if you don't do what we like, we're going to control the supply of rare earths. Frankly, I think that's a self-defeating move by the Chinese, because as people are going to start to say, well, if China's not a reliable market, we need to think about how we prepare for that.
But it seemed that Japan was surprised by the incredibly strong position that China took.
I think Japan was surprised. Some people say, well, Japan took a surprisingly strong position with the fishermen, but the fact is this has been building over the last 10 or 12 months, and the incident with that fishing boat was not the first confrontation they'd had in that area. And I think the Chinese would say, look, we're not being aggressive, we're just asserting our rights. But the problem is there's a conflict over whose rights are whose. And that Taiwan is a dramatic example in a sense, but interestingly, Taiwan's been relatively quiet. We've had trouble in the Senkakus, we've had a little bit of trouble in the Yellow Sea off Korea, we've had some trouble in the South China Sea and Southeast Asia. The last couple of years, I think partly because of a big improvement in Taiwan and cross-straits relations, the Taiwan issue has been quieter. But I don't want to sound like an apologist for the Chinese, but they would say we're not being aggressive, we're just asserting what's rightfully ours. Well, assert it, but don't assert it through the use of force. That's really got to be considered unacceptable. I think that's the key over the long term to managing this Taiwan issue, which is admittedly a difficult issue for both sides, but it's not a one-sided issue where it simply belongs to Beijing and that's the end of the discussion. There has to be a commitment to a peaceful resolution, which means a commitment to letting this take a long time. Mm-hmm. One of the good things is historically the Chinese are known to be patient people. I don't know whether it's true or not, but it's famously said that Henry Kissinger was chatting with Zhou Enlai and asked him what he thought had been the influence of the French Revolution on history, and Zhou Enlai said it's much too soon to tell.
Much too soon to tell. Well, it seems that under the current government in Taipei, the relationship has flourished between China and Taiwan because they have specifically focused on areas where they have common interest and no apparent disputes of significance. And it seems to be a very constructive way of managing the relationship for mutual benefit.
I think it has been, without any question, and I think President Ma deserves a lot of credit for that. I think, to be honest, I think he deserves more support than he's gotten from the United States to bolster his position, because he's carrying out the kind of policy that for 10 years under his predecessor, the U.S. was pushing for this kind of more conciliatory policy toward the mainland. unfortunately, and I think this really is unfortunate, the mainland has not chosen to, I mean, they've responded in a positive way to his overtures on cross-straits economic relations, but it hasn't led to any mitigation of the military buildup against Taiwan. And so it looks very clearly as though they want to intimidate the people there, and that only makes this desire for some form of independence, if anything, stronger. So it's counterproductive.
What about China and India? These are two countries, behemoths in the region and in the world, and haven't always had the friendliest of relations in the past, but now they both are on courses that seem to be taking them to virtually unlimited economic successes, and inevitably they will engage each other more in that realm. How do you see the relationship developing?
I think there's a certain underlying tension that's not likely to go away. There are border disputes. There's, this may sound like an old-fashioned way of expressing it, but there's actually an ideological difference. And I think in that respect, although China in most respects seems like somewhat the stronger of the two parties, the Indians are very confident in their democratic system. I'm not so sure the Chinese are as confident in their neo-Maoist system. The Chinese give a lot of indication of understanding that over time the country the legitimacy of the regime has to be based more and more on some kind of popular democratic process. They're awfully vague about what that means. But every time they loosen up a little and allow some local elections, they start to get worried that the elections are going the wrong way, and they clamp down. And it really brings to mind the Chinese saying that he who rides a tiger has to be very careful when dismounting. I mean, they haven't figured out how to dismount from this tiger, and yet I think they realize that this is not a system that really is, I'm overstating. I believe they understand that this is not a system that is sustainable for a long time with a large growing middle class. At some point, we've seen it elsewhere, we've seen it in South Korea, we've seen it in many countries. You get an educated middle class and they want a stronger say in how they're ruled.
So as India and China continue their rise, will their relationship become the dominant one globally in terms of economics, and how does that affect the United States?
I would say we're still a long way from that being the case, and that we're in danger of forgetting a bit too quickly that Japan it's no longer the number 2 economy in the world. It is the number 3. It's got a lot of strength in it. It's true it has a severe demographic problem, which is going to make it hard to get back to anything like its earlier dynamism. But I wouldn't. We've underestimated Japan in the past. I think we might be underestimating it now. The combination of Japan and South Korea and Australia is our 3 democratic allies in the Asia-Pacific region, along with the United States, is still arguably the most important and both economically and in the other attributes of power, most important part of that region. I think there is a certain natural harmony between the U.S. and our democratic allies in India, which is another democracy, but definitely not maybe a strategic partner. I'm not sure they even like that term. They're fairly fierce about their non-alignment. It goes back many years. But I think if you look at we have fewer conflicting interests and more common interests, I think, than potentially with China. Having said that, it can't stress enough that I think everyone in that part of the world puts a high priority on maintaining the peace, including the Chinese. It doesn't mean they'll give up what they think of as their critical interests simply in order to maintain the peace, but it's a very powerful factor working in favor of that. I was about to say in our favor. I think the U.S. has a huge interest in peace in that part of the world, and we don't have territorial disputes. We don't have some of the same conflicts that others have. So the fact is, the more they become concerned about one another, the more they want us around. And this notion a few years back that we were the sole superpower and we could therefore throw our weight around, I think was really misplaced. The fact is, we have more influence when we're not the only power and when people are looking over their shoulder at someone else.
How does Russia fit into this rising power discussion? I know after the fall of the Soviet Union, there was a lot of enthusiasm initially in the United States about what the possibilities were, and we were there, you know, encouraging and willing to help, and then the system seemed like it took a few steps backward in terms of trying to maintain control and develop a sense of direction. And obviously any government that emerges out of a communist environment is going to take a while to find its footing. Do you think Russia is there now? And what do you see its democratic prospects being?
There are people who say that Russia is simply reverting to its historic foreign policy, going back to Alexander I, or you name which czar, maybe Peter the Great, that somehow there's this long continuous line that's always been that way. I guess in the way I'm saying that, I'm a little bit skeptical. I think it's true there is a certain Russian traditions, both in the way they're used to being governed and the way they're used to treating their neighbors. But the world has changed a lot over that period of time, and colonial empires in general have evaporated. The Soviet Union was sort of the last real one. And I think one of the very important things is that prosperity in this era depends on how you free up the creative energies of your people. And the system the Russians have today, it's a lot better than under the Soviets, but it's still, it's stifling a lot of potential. And I would think it's, at some point there will be some positive pressure for change, but I wouldn't expect it anytime soon. And a Czech minister said to me recently, I thought it was a thoughtful observation about his own country, that having spent 50 years under various kinds of totalitarian regimes, meaning first the German occupation and then the Soviet domination, it takes a long time to work that out of your system. Didn't quite say this, but I think it's almost as though you need a new generation that didn't grow up under that system. So Russia has a much longer way to go with a much longer, deeper rooted regime of terror, if you like. And what they have today, I do find rather disturbing. But one thing that I think may change at some point in the future, and that's how Russia views its position in the world. The odd thing is that they seem to be friendly with China and picking fights with the West, but the most insecure part of Russia is the Russian Far East, where at some point it might turn out to be a matter of some friction between Russia and China, at which point they might be turning westward for some help. The bottom line, Russia is not a rising power. Russia has got a declining population. It's got a real democratic cliff that it's heading over, demographic cliff, excuse me. And the economy is largely sustained by oil. So it's big and it's important, but I wouldn't put it in the same category as the sort of dynamic countries like China, like Brazil, like Indonesia, like India, like Turkey.
Speaking of Brazil, this was a rising power that I think very few people in the general population probably didn't see coming. Because Brazil has turned around so many things in a relatively short period of time. Was this on your radar screen as a rising power?
It's interesting. I was, when I was dean at Johns Hopkins in the 90s, one of our senior faculty, Professor Oued, is a Brazil specialist, and he was very bullish on Brazil. and I began to be. And then I don't remember which particular crisis hit Brazil in the mid-90s, late 90s, and some of the optimism faded. But I think the underlying strength was observable back then. I do think a lot of the credit goes to having a government that knows how to steer this difficult course between left and right and keep on a pragmatic direction. And certainly Lula has done that. It's a marked contrast to the demagogues in Venezuela and Bolivia. And I think it helps to keep, maybe this is like Nixon to China, it helps when market policies are introduced by leaders from the left, because they manage to sell what can sometimes be slightly difficult medicine. But one thing that Brazil has going for it that also is underestimated, it's a very peaceful country, has been for, as far as I know, throughout its history. A Brazilian friend of mine said, well, that's the problem, it's been too peaceful, we've never really been challenged, we don't press hard enough. If that was the case once, I think there are enough people in Brazil who have that glint in their eye now.
Is there any other country in Latin America and the Caribbean that has this kind of potential, or even, you know, on a smaller scale, but similar?
Well, I think there are two that, and one that's clearly does, and we don't pay enough attention to, in my view, and that's Chile. And I'm told that part of the problem is that the whole issue of economics is maybe more politicized in Latin America than anywhere else, and Chile is seen as a success of the right, and therefore it's not something that other people are comfortable saying it should be a model. But it's certainly done very well. I think Colombia, in recent years, thanks to the improved security situation, has begun to do well. And I hope we'll proceed with this free trade agreement with Colombia. It's entirely in our interest. We're the biggest beneficiaries. And Peru has been doing well recently. One of the problems in Latin America, and I guess the Asian autocrats would say that's a problem with democracy, is sometimes they start doing well and then they do well for 4 or 5 years and then they hit some kind of new crisis. So the sustained success is what can be hard to achieve. We'll see what happens in Brazil now with a new president, but hopefully the policies have a certain enduring strength, because people, I mean, success builds on success in a case like that.
Sure. And as you look elsewhere around the world, what would be the short list of countries that would be in this, you know, rising power potential situation?
Well, certainly Indonesia, and hugely important because of its location, because of its religious diversity, and because of the fact that it's a majority Muslim country that has a tradition of tolerance, which is devoutly to be wished for in this world. Slightly smaller, but Vietnam, which is the size roughly of France or the UK. We forget how big some of these smaller Asian countries are, which has been doing very well. Turkey, which, if you count it as a European country, I guess is the second largest country in Europe after Germany. Well, I guess you have to count Russia third. But anyway, Turkey is huge, and again important partly because of its position between East and West. In Africa, South Africa is very important. There it's challenged. It's almost like two societies still living side by side, not in apartheid, but nevertheless huge inequality between the whites and the thin sliver of black elite and most of the rest of the population. But very important. It's been an engine of growth for the rest of Africa. And I guess in the hopefully maybe someday category, I'd put Nigeria. 150 million people, incredible oil resources. It should be doing well, but it hasn't been.
Good. Well, with that, we'll need to conclude. Thank you very much for joining us today, Mr.
It's been
Wolfowitz.
fun to be here. It's a good conference.
And thank you. For the Global Perspective Show, I'm John Bersia. We'll see you next time.
This program was made possible by funding from the UCF Global Perspectives Office.